Alright team, let's take it on home. Let's finish out chapter 23 with concept 23.4. It's all about natural selection, and as a subreddit to natural selection, we're going to talk about sexual selection as well. It says natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently causes adaptive evolution. Natural selection is the portion of evolution that is not random. It is kind of in a stepwise fashion. I'm going to say choosing for the best traits, but I don't want you to think that nature has some grand design in mind or some end goal in mind. That's not the case at all. There is no agency in nature. It's not making this conscious decision, but it does lead toward a better match between living creatures and their environment, and that's what adaptive evolution is all about. Definitely not a random process here. So evolution by natural selection involves both chance and sorting. The chance part does come in with the mutations. So you have to have mutations to provide the raw material for natural selection to work off of, because you have to have genetic variety. No genetic variety means no differences in creatures, and if you have no differences, you have no natural selection ability to work, no ability for change and adaptation. So you have to have a little bit of chance in the mutations to begin with, but after that, beneficial alleles are sorted and favored by natural selection. And again, when you use those words like sorted and favored, it makes it sound like nature has some sort of agency or some sort of mind of some kind. That's not the case at all, but it's just helpful to use those words to get across the idea of what we're talking about. Only natural selection consistently results in adaptive evolution. To say it a second way, or to take a closer look, we can say that natural selection consistently increases the frequency of alleles that provide reproductive advantage, and that thus leads to adaptive evolution. So over time, creatures that have genetic alleles that lead to their ability to survive and in major part to reproduce, they are the ones that get chosen. Again, I hate to use that word, but we're going to use that word to kind of describe the process. Chosen by natural selection. And so natural selection brings about this adaptive evolution by acting on an organism's phenotype. Remember, natural selection doesn't really act on the alleles, on the genes themselves. It acts on the outward characteristics of those alleles. It acts on, say, the speed of the animal or the color of the fur of the animal, the phenotype. That's what natural selection actually acts on, and through the phenotype it changes the genetics of a population. Oftentimes when you talk about evolution and natural selection, you hear these phrases like struggle for existence or survival of the fittest, and I try to avoid saying those types of phrases because they can be misleading, and people who don't have a good thorough understanding of evolution can kind of get a poor misunderstanding as far as how the process works, because survival of the fittest tends to imply that there's always direct competition among individuals, and only the strongest and fastest and largest and smartest are the ones that survive. And it's a lot more complicated than that. Yes, sometimes there is direct competition. Oftentimes that's competition amongst males for the right to mate, or competition amongst creatures for a particular territory. So yeah, in some cases you do have direct battling going on, but reproductive success is generally a lot more subtle, and it depends on quite a few more factors than just head-to-head battling. Really what we're talking about is relative fitness. Relative fitness is the contribution of one particular individual creature, what its contribution is to the gene pool of the next generation, comparable or relative to the contributions of other individuals. If you have two male birds of a particular species, and one of those male birds has certain alleles, certain genetics that enhances the survival of their offspring more than the other bird, well then that bird's offspring are more likely to reproduce and go on and pass on those alleles. So we're talking basically about relative fitness between different organisms in a population. Selection favors certain genotypes by acting on the phenotypes. So nature is acting on the expression of the genes, not really directly on the genes themselves. When we see natural selection in action, and that means the population is not at this Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium that we discussed, we're going to see changes occur. We're going to see changes in the allele frequency of the population, and we're going to see these changes occur in about three major ways. There's three kind of possible outcomes here, three modes of selection, and they're called directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. We're going to find that directional selection favors individuals at one end of the phenotypic range. In other words, it moves the population, it moves the genetics of the population in one direction. This is pretty common when we have some sort of environmental change, or maybe when there's migration to a new or different habitat. You'll see the entire population over time shift in one particular direction toward one end of the range of phenotypes. And I'll show you a picture in just a moment to make it a little bit more clear. The second type of selection is called disruptive selection. Disruptive selection favors individuals at the far extreme ends of the phenotypic range. So the middle area where you would expect to see the majority, that becomes kind of like a no man's land. And so selection is saying, okay, you should be white or black, but not gray, because gray is not good for some reason. So that would be disruptive selection. And again, I'll show you a picture in just a moment. The last one is stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection would be the opposite of disruptive. Stabilizing favors the intermediate variant, and it acts against the extreme outer edges of the phenotypes. So it kind of maintains a status quo, and the middle ground is what's favored in stabilizing selection. A good example in humans of stabilizing selection is birth weight for human babies. Birth weight for human babies has tended to range from about 6.6 to 8.8 pounds for the vast majority of babies for quite some time now. And that's because selection kind of works toward that stabilization, because babies who are below that range tend to be preemies, or they are born at a lower birth weight and they tend to have more physical ailments and problems surviving. And babies who are larger than that particular range, they tend to have trouble being born. They tend to have trouble passing out of the mom in delivery, and so that can cause problems at birth for both the baby and the mother. So there is a stabilizing effect to where most babies tend toward this 6.6 to 8.8 pound range, because the two outside extremes of smaller and larger than that both cause problems. So here's that picture to kind of make things a bit more clear. At the top we have this population of mice. This would be like the original population that we're starting out with. The red line shows the frequency of the frequency of individuals that fall within the phenotypes here. So if we have in this population mice that range from white all the way to sort of this gray black, and we see the majority of them fall in between at sort of a light brown color. So this is our original population that we're starting with. Now if we have directional selection, the entire population, the genetics, move toward one side or the other. Let's say that these mice live in Hawaii, and on the island where they are, there happens to be a number of active volcanoes, and after a couple of eruptions over a long period of time, the soil is blackened and it has become darker because of the volcanic eruptions. Well, in that case, the environment has changed, and now the soil background that the mice live on is darker. Well, that would tend to have directional selection toward darker fur. So over a period of years, you may end up eventually with no white mice, and with a greater amount of the population at a darker color. So the population has evolved in one direction toward this end of the phenotype range, and it has evolved to be darker over time on average, and again that's in response to environmental pressure. Then we have disruptive selection. Let's say that we have these mice that live on this island, and after a hurricane there were a number of hawks that were blown in from the mainland. And these hawks are fairly interesting. They have excellent eyesight like most hawks do, but the color they see best is light brown. So for whatever reason these hawks see light brown the best. Well, that would be disruptive selection. In that case, you would be better off to either be a white mouse or a black mouse. You don't want to fall in the middle, because that's what the hawks can see the best, and so over time you might find virtually no light brown mice, but you might find two different groups of populations of the mouse on either end of the spectrum here. That would be disruptive selection. Finally, last but not least, you have stabilizing selection. Let's say, for example, again, we could talk about an environmental change to where perhaps there was a flood and all the dark soil got washed away from where these mice live, and it showed the bare brown rock. So now their environment has changed to be primarily brown rock. And this would be stabilizing selection, to where if you were at either end, white or black, probably wouldn't be good. You would have a hard time camouflaging yourself. You'd get eaten more likely by predators. So this would tend to stabilize the middle ground, the light brown. So you have three possible variations of selection: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. Your book does a good job of showing a number of examples of the pretty amazing adaptive evolution traits that animals have gained over time. So natural selection has done a great job of matching creatures to their environment, and two great examples are the cuttlefish. If you go online, go to YouTube and look up cuttlefish camouflage, you'll see some amazing videos. Cuttlefish are very similar to octopus or squids. They don't really have any defense mechanism. They don't have fangs or bones or poison or anything like that. But what they do have is excellent camouflage. They can actually change their skin coloration to match almost any background, and they can even change the way their skin looks to be in a shape that resembles seaweed or rocks or plants. They're masters of camouflage. Another good example that is closer to northeast Texas would be snakes, and how certain snakes have the ability to unhinge their jaws and swallow prey that's larger than their own heads. Here's a good example of a chicken snake that you might find in your hen house eating the eggs. The eggs have a lot of nutrition. That's a great source of nutrition for the snake, but it does no good if he can't get into the egg or swallow the egg. So he has, through adaptive evolution, developed this jaw that can unhinge. Basically, he will engulf the entire egg. Usually they will then break the egg within the body, and they'll absorb the embryo inside the egg, and then they'll either spit the shell back out, or it'll eventually work its way through their digestive system and out the other end. Here's another great example of this little gecko who is very well camouflaged. Adaptive evolution has caused him to look very similar to the background that he primarily lives on, and so natural selection increases the frequency of alleles that enhance survival and reproduction, and over time creatures become better and better matched to their environment. Now the problem is environments don't ever or rarely stay the same forever. Now in some cases you'll find creatures that haven't changed very much over time. Say, for example, think about like a crocodile or an alligator. Those creatures have stayed relatively stable, their population has. Now, yes, they have undergone evolution, but overall, if you looked at a crocodile from today and from thousands of years ago, they're virtually identical. And that may be because their environment really hasn't changed much, and they are kind of the apex predator in their environment. So there hasn't been a lot of selective pressure on them to evolve or change over time. But because environments do change, adaptive evolution is not a static process. It's a continuous dynamic process, but it certainly is the process that leads to the greatest amount of change, and to the greatest amount of change that is beneficial for creatures over time. Let's talk briefly about kind of a subset of natural selection, which is called sexual selection. Charles Darwin was also one of the first scientists to explore this idea of sexual selection, which is a form of selection in which individuals with certain inherited characteristics are more likely to obtain a mate than others. So in sexual selection, you have not really the fight for survival, but the fight to reproduce, the fight to find a mate and pass on your genetics. Sexual selection is basically natural selection for mating success, and it can result in some pretty striking what we call sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is where the male and female can look quite a bit different from each other. The sexual characteristics that they display can be attractive to the other male or female, but they may even be detrimental to the survival of the creature itself. And a great example is right here with a peacock. You can see where the female peacock and the male peacock, they do not look a whole lot like each other. The male peacock has this tremendous, huge, beautiful a gaudy tail plumage, and the female is just kind of a grayish dirt brown. The female is the one who has to sit on the eggs and guard the nest. Probably wiser that she's a bit more camouflaged. This guy is not camouflaged at all. He stands out like a neon sign. So why would this happen? Because certainly if you look at this tail, there's no way that helps the male hide from predators. It's not a weapon. It certainly doesn't help him run or fly or get away faster. The only thing it helps him do is attract a mate. And that is important enough. If he can attract a mate and breed before he gets killed because of this tail, well then the tail is worth it, and that is part of sexual selection. Sexual selection comes in basically two different varieties. We have what's called intrasexual selection. That's competition among one sex, usually the males, for mates of the opposite sex. So for example, when you see video of two Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep and the males are having this epic battle where they're slamming their horns into each other, or you see moose or deer or elk fighting it out, that's intrasexual selection, where there is major competition between one set of sex for the mating rights to the other sex, and this is almost always males. The other type is called intersexual selection. Intersexual selection is called mate choice, and this occurs when one individual, or the individuals of one sex, and in this case it's almost always females, are the ones making the decisions and are particularly choosy in selecting their mates. So you may see certain birds that go through these elaborate courtship displays. The peacock is a good example. So his tail feathers, he's trying to basically woo a female and get a female to agree to mate with him. Other birds will create these elaborate nests, or they'll do these elaborate dances, and that's all intersexual selection, where the female kind of calls the shots, and so generally speaking the males are the ones that are trying to impress the female and woo the female to allow him to mate with her. There are some pretty amazing examples of this in nature, and again, this can even go against their survival rate of the males. You can have males that have such displays for the attraction of females that they don't even help them survive. And like that peacock tail, there is no way that that's going to help him find food or escape a predator. The only thing it does is potentially help him find a mate. So he better hope that he mates before that tail gets him killed, because that's all it's good for. But that is okay. That trait will continue as long as that ensures that he can find a mate prior to his death. And that's what sexual selection is all about. One good question that you might ask is, why the heck does a female peacock desire a male with that giant showy tail? Or why does a female bird choose a male bird that builds, the fanciest nest? What is the point of that? Well, the hypothesis is usually called the good genes hypothesis, and the good genes hypothesis suggests that these traits that the female is looking at, it's not that the female peacock really cares about this big beautiful tail, it's what the big beautiful tail represents. If you are a male peacock and you are healthy and strong enough that you get plenty of food and plenty of rest, and you've escaped predators long enough to grow this big beautiful tail, well, that's a sign that you probably have some superior genetics. So it's not that the female is necessarily interested in that big beautiful tail, it's interested in the fact that that tail is kind of representative of good genetics. And this, you would think, okay, well that's in the animal world, but humans are part of the animal world as well, and you can find this good genes hypothesis occurring even among human beings. So although a lot of humans like to think that we're somewhat removed from the natural world, why do you think many men go and work out at the gym on a regular basis? Sure, they may tell you it's because they want to be healthy and it's for their own purposes, but in reality we know a lot of them are going to try to make themselves look more attractive to females. Or why do females go to the tanning salon so often? They may give you a variety of reasons, but we know in reality that many females feel that when their skin is tanned, that's more attractive to males. Or you could ask, why do both sexes, male and female, display status symbols like flashy jewelry or fancy cars and things of that nature? Well, that is all part of sexual selection. Even in humans, we are trying to show or impress a mate. So a female may not be interested in the Porsche that the man is driving, but she may be interested in that as a symbol of how the man can provide for her, or vice versa. The male may not be interested in the flashy jewelry of the female, but he may take that as a sign of something that he is interested in. So even humans have this process occurring. We just don't really think about it that way. Here's a good example that your textbook has, where there's this particular frog and the female frog is the one making the choice here. So this is intersexual selection, and the female frog has kind of the choice between two different males here. Some of the males have what we call a short call, a short mating call, and then some of the males have what is called a long mating call. And you can see this one lasts for a little bit longer amount of time and it sounds a little bit different. Overall, the females prefer the males with the long call. And really, why? Why would the female frog care about the length of the mating call? Well, the good gene hypothesis says that perhaps there is a correlation between the frogs that do the long call and some other genetic component. And we see that when you compare the offspring, when you compare the offspring of these frogs, either the ones who mate with the short call or the long call, you see that the females who mate with the long call frogs tend to have better surviving offspring. The survival rate of their larval tadpoles is better with the long call, or it's not affected at all. Their larval growth is better with the long call or not affected at all. And the time to metamorphosis, which faster is better, is better with the long call frogs. So it's really not the length of the frog song, but it's what that represents. And so the female is choosing based on the possibility that these genetics turn out to be better, and in this case that is the fact. One of the last things we want to talk about is, why are there still negative genes in the gene pool? If natural selection has been occurring for such a long time, what has prevented natural selection from reducing genetic variation at certain loci by completely getting rid of, culling all the unfavorable alleles? We know that a lot of variation in a population is neutral. In other words, when you have certain changes within the genetics of the population, a lot of those don't really have any effect. If it's a difference in a DNA sequence that doesn't confer a selective advantage or disadvantage, we would call that neutral. But a lot of variation is either good or bad. So we're talking about variation that is either good or bad. Why is there still bad variation? How come that's not all been sifted out by natural selection? Well, there's actually a couple of different reasons for that, and we're going to take a look at certain things that will stabilize selection and keep those recessive genes or those potentially harmful genes in the population. The first mechanism for keeping some of those genes around is diploidy. Remember, diploidy is creatures that have two sets of chromosomes, like human beings and most other mammals have two sets of chromosomes. Well, diploidy allows for a lot of variation hidden from selection in the form of recessive alleles. Recall that you can be a heterozygous individual, which means you are carrying the recessive allele, but you're never going to see that. And remember, natural selection acts on the phenotype, not the genes. So you can have recessive alleles that are less favorable than the dominant alleles, and sometimes those recessive alleles can even be harmful. They can stay because they propagate through heterozygous individuals. So you can be a carrier of a particular allele that could be harmful, or maybe at the least is not helpful, but you're never going to see that because you're a carrier, you're heterozygous for that particular trait. So this variation, this latent variation of this allele, can only be acted on by natural selection when it shows up in the phenotype. And the only time you're going to see that is if you're homozygous recessive. So homozygous recessives might be affected by natural selection, but a heterozygous individual would not be affected by natural selection for that particular trait, because that that recessive allele is hidden because you're not homozygous recessive. this heterozygote protection, it sort of maintains this huge pool of recessive alleles that might not be favored under the present environmental conditions, but it's kind of good that they stick around, because what if the environmental conditions change? If the environmental conditions change, you may find that those recessive hidden alleles suddenly turn out to be positive, and suddenly the homozygous recessive creatures may be the ones that are most favored, and then suddenly they would be the ones reproducing the most often, and what was a recessive, potentially damaging allele now suddenly becomes the favored allele, and perhaps it goes on to become the most common in the population. So it's actually a good thing that some of these alleles kind of stick around in heterozygous individuals, because if the environment changes, the alleles that are beneficial may change as well. The last mechanism we're going to look at for maintaining some of these alleles is called balancing selection. Balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of 2 or more phenotypes in a particular population. And that can happen from what we call heterozygote advantage or frequency-dependent selection. Heterozygote advantage, you can kind of tell from the name what that's all about. In this particular instance, for some reason, the heterozygote state, the heterozygous state, is the one that is preferred by natural selection. And that's usually because the heterozygotes have some sort of higher fitness than either the homozygous recessive or the homozygous dominants in this particular case. So then natural selection will tend to maintain 2 or more alleles at that locus, so you maintain this heterozygosity. And a good example that we've actually already talked about last semester was sickle cell. If you are homozygous recessive for sickle cell, you have the full-blown disease, and that comes with a variety of health problems. If you are heterozygous for this trait, you have a lesser form of the disease, and you may still have some health problems, but not nearly as severe. But the heterozygous form actually provides you a benefit as well. It confers a resistance to malaria, which is a common disease in areas around the equator and Central Africa, hot, sticky, humid areas where there's lots of mosquitoes. Malaria tends to be passed by mosquitoes. And then, of course, if you're homozygous dominant, you don't have the disease at all, but you also don't have this malaria resistance. So in some way, it's better to be heterozygous for this trait. You are going to have a minor variation of sickle cell anemia, but you're also going to have resistance to malaria. And in some parts of the world, that resistance to malaria is enough to make it a benefit. Here's a map of Africa and the Middle East, and you can see in India, and you can see the frequency of the sickle cell allele ranges from 0 to over 12.5%, and the little dots represent the spread or the distribution of a particular parasite that passes through mosquitoes that causes malaria. So you can see in the concentrated areas where malaria is more likely, you have a higher frequency of the sickle cell allele. That's because natural selection tends to choose for that allele. So yes, you have sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia, but you get this resistance from malaria. So if you're heterozygous, you get effectively the best of both worlds. You don't have the full-blown disease, but you get some of the malaria resistance. And you can see where the frequency of the allele fades away the further you get from the high intensity distribution of the malaria parasite. So this would be heterozygote advantage, where you're going to maintain that recessive allele because it's some sort of benefit to be heterozygous. The last way that we can maintain some of these recessive alleles, or some of these alleles that might otherwise be problematic, is through something called frequency-dependent selection. And that basically means that there's kind of a flip-flopping effect that you're going to see, and I'll show you in just a moment, that the fitness of a phenotype declines if it becomes too common in the population. So there is a particular fish, I'll show you a picture here, and this fish is either born with what we call a left mouth or a right mouth, and that's controlled by one gene, and it's either left or right. There is no in between. So you can see that the fish, his mouth kind of tends to turn one direction or the other. And this particular type of fish is a scale-eating fish. It survives by sneaking up on other fish and taking a bite out of their backside there and eating a bit of scale off of them. Now this fish attacks from the right because of his shape of mouth, and this one will attack from the left based on his shape of mouth. Well, when there is more of this left mouth fish, the guys that are getting eaten, they learn to avoid them because they learn that, hey, they're going to keep attacking from this side. So if there's a whole bunch of the left mouth fish in the population, you would be better off being the right mouth fish, because you're going to have a better chance of getting your meal because everyone is looking for this guy. So in some cases, you're better off being whatever the majority of the population is not, and we call that frequency dependent selection. So in the graph you can see how the allele frequency, left mouth and right mouth, kind of flip-flops back and forth over the years, and it swings like a pendulum left and right. So in some years the dominant allele is better to have, and in some years the recessive allele is better to have. It depends on the population around you. So that's another way that some of these recessive alleles can kind of stay in place. Alright, let's bring this chapter to a close with a couple of really good thought questions about natural selection. One good thought question that I hear or have heard in the past is, so if natural selection has been going on for millions of years, and it has, why aren't all creatures basically perfect at this point? If natural selection makes them better and better and better, how come all creatures are not basically perfect? Well, that is a bit of a misunderstanding about natural selection. So let's take a quick look at 4 things that will help answer that question. First off, natural selection can only act on existing variations. Natural selection favors the fittest phenotypes of what's available currently in that population, and that may not be the ideal trait. For example, with this little cartoon of a beaver, if there was a beaver that was born with a chainsaw for an arm, well, that would be pretty awesome, and natural selection would probably work toward increasing that possibility. But there isn't a beaver born with a chainsaw for an arm, and living creatures don't automatically get what they want or what would be best for them. Natural selection doesn't grant an organism what it needs, so the little beaver is never going to get his little chainsaw arm down there, because new advantageous alleles, mutations, don't just pop up on demand. The beaver just can't go home one night and say, man, I wish I could have a mutation that would turn my arm into a chainsaw. That doesn't mean the mutation will pop up. Mutations are random. Sometimes the population is lucky and there is a mutation that turns out to be helpful and it confers an advantage. But natural selection can only work on the variation that is currently existing in the population. Number 2, evolution is limited by historical constraints. Basically, evolution can only work with the materials that it's given. Each species has a long history, a legacy of descent with modification from its ancient ancestral forms, and evolution doesn't get the opportunity to scrap everything that came before and start all over again. You have to build new from the old. You have to basically recycle instead of building brand new. So evolution kind of co-ops existing structures and adapts them to new situations. You can imagine if we have a terrestrial land-based animal that has, say, 4 legs for running, or has 2 legs for running and 2 arms for holding or swinging, like a monkey or a human. You would imagine if you want to confer the advantage of flight to that creature, why take away one of their sets of legs or arms? Why not just have them sprout an entire new set of limbs to have wings? So that way they could have legs and arms and wings, or they could have 4 legs and wings. That would be better. But that's not how evolution works. Unless that mutation arose, natural selection can't choose for it. So what happens instead is, in the case of, say, a bat or a bird or a whale, the arms or legs of the creature has to be adapted and changed over time. So in the case of a bat, what was arms or forelimbs became wings, and in the case of a whale, what was arms or legs for walking on land eventually became flippers. So evolution doesn't just get to create from scratch because it wants to. It has to work with what it's got. And that would be like, say you're walking across campus, and this is a silly example, but it's the best one I can think of right off the top of my head. If you're walking across the global campus outside and suddenly a rainstorm pours down rain on your head, you have to use what you've got. Yeah, it would be great if you had an umbrella, but you can't just snap your fingers and suddenly create or make an umbrella. So you have to use what you have available, and you may take your book bag. Its purpose is to carry books, but you may use it to shield your head from the rain. So you've adapted that book bag for another purpose. That's exactly what evolution does. Evolution creates biological tools to deal with environmental needs, but it has to use the raw materials that it has. It doesn't just get new material just because that is the need. Number 3, adaptations are almost always compromises. Living creatures have a lot to do. They have to survive, they have to find food, they have to escape predators, they have to find a mate, they have to do a wide variety of things. So because living creatures have so many demands on them, they oftentimes have to have traits that are good for a variety of things, so you have to have a compromise. A good example is a seal. A seal spends a fair amount of his life on the land, and he is horrible on the land. These little fat flippers that they have is not very good for walking on rocks or on the beach, and it would be much better if he had legs like a dog or a horse, but then he would be a horrible swimmer. And because swimming is more important to the seal's life than walking on land, he's going to make do with the flippers that he has. That's a compromise. Even in humans, humans owe much of their versatility and athleticism and flexibility to our fingers and hands and our flexible limbs and our thumbs. These are all great for various uses that we use those joints and fingers for, but it also makes us very prone to sprains and torn ligaments and dislocations. Our arms and wrists and fingers are not particularly stable and strong, so we're giving up some structural integrity and structural reinforcement for agility. That's a compromise that evolution has made in our particular instance. Last but not least, you have to remember that there's a combination of factors at play here. You do have the chance portion, so you have certain mutations that arise by chance, and natural selection can only work on the mutations that have arisen by chance. And then you have changes in the environment. So for example, let's look at the adaptations of a polar bear, which makes him very well adapted for his living in the Arctic. But if you were to take that polar bear and drop him into the middle of the Amazon rainforest, suddenly all his adaptations and all the alleles that he carries in his body that were helpful, suddenly they're not helpful at all. So when the environment changes, certain alleles that were beneficial can become no longer beneficial, and then over time the population has to change again. So it's like a target that's always moving. There is no end goal. There is no perfect example of any particular species, because perfection in this case doesn't exist. You're simply trying to match as closely as you can your environment to enhance your own rate of survivability. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up right there. I put this funny little Homo sapien cartoon down there. You have this funny cartoon that represents this horrible example of what some people think evolution is, going from Monkeys etiolatus to Chimpus imbecilis to Apis stupidus to Neanderslob to Homo sapien. So oftentimes when I hear people discuss evolution, they don't always have all the information that they should, and it's not exactly what some people claim it to be. I highly suggest, if you're at all interested in this topic, you go and seek out the best scientific information that is available. And it's a fascinating topic, and I really love this topic because it shows how human beings, all living creatures, are interconnected. And for me, I really like that idea of being interconnected with all other living creatures on the planet. So I hope you've enjoyed this chapter. We're going to move on from here. Good luck. Make sure you take your quiz this weekend, and if you have any questions, let me know. Bye-bye.